everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. I just wanted to make a quick announcement at the beginning. This is going to cover general municipal elections, which are covered by the New York State election law. So that would be county, town, state assembly, state senate, those types of elections. I will not be covering school district elections today. We are going to set up a separate webinar just past the first of the year for school district elections, which is so it'll be a little bit closer to your election time, and we'll cover all of the new updates, including the early mail-ins. So if you want to hop on, please believe me, I will not be offended. But yeah, today we're just going to be covering general elections. Okay, hop to the next slide. Oh. So general elections are covered by the New York State election law. Under this law, it sets political primaries to occur the fourth Tuesday in June before every general election. Next year, the presidential primary, which is separate from the other political primaries, is set to occur April 2nd. And the general election occurs on the first Tuesday that succeeds the Monday in November of this year. Next slide. School district and school district library elections, as I mentioned before, those are covered by a separate set of laws. Those are set forth in the New York State education law, and those elections are on the third Tuesday of May each year. Next slide. And then village elections are also governed by the New York State election law, and those occur on the third Tuesday in March. So those are set at a different time than the regular general election, but they are covered by most of the same law. We're actually going to talk about village elections first because there are some specific for those. Next slide. So the special rules for village elections. Village clerks are required to publish notice at least 4 months prior to the election, which will set forth the office or the offices to be filled in the terms. So anything that's up for election that year, whether it's mayor or the council position, like that, village clerk, those positions. Then at least 60 days before the election, the Board of Trustees has to adopt a resolution setting forth the polling place for each election district and hours during which the polls will be open. There's no set amount of hours other than it has to be at least from 12 p.m. to 9 p.m., but they can be set much earlier than that as well. Next slide. And then at least 10 days before the election, the village clerk has to publish a notice in the local newspaper stating the polling place for each election district, the hours the polls will be open, and then the names and addresses of all the nominees and offices they're running for. And then an abstract of any proposition, if there's any voter propositions or that come from the voters or come from the board that are being put on the ballot, those have to have some written. And then in addition to publishing it in the newspaper, a copy of the notice must be posted in 6 conspicuous public places within the village and at each polling place at least a day before the election. Next slide. These are still continuing special rules for village elections. So if the village uses voting machines, there has to be one voting machine for every 800 qualified voters. So if you have 2,400 voters in your district, you need to have it. So, at least 40 days before the election, the Board of Trustees is supposed to appoint 2 or 4 inspectors for each village election district. And a lot of villages will only have 1 election district. They're not large enough to require more than 1, so it might just be important. And then this resolution will also fix their compensation and their administration. Each inspector has to file an oath with the village clerk prior to assuming the duties, which is a very simple loyalty oath that's similar to the one that's filed by board members when they're sworn in. For village elections, applications for absentee ballots are directed to the village clerk as well. They must be signed by the applicant and they have to be received no earlier than 4 months before the election and no later than 7 days before the election if they want the ballot. If they want it, they want the village clerk to hand them the absentee ballot, they can do that on the day of the election. and then the ballots have to be received by the clerk. For the election inspector, I mentioned, there's no requirement that they be split equally amongst the parties if both parties aren't represented on, if both parties weren't represented on the previous ballot. If your town, leans one way completely and all of the candidates are from the Democratic Party, you do not have to split the election inspectors between one or the other. If you do have candidates that are both from the Democratic and the Republican Party in your last election, in this election, they do have to split equally. So you have to do either one Republican and one Democrat, or two Republicans and two Democrats as inspectors. And you have to continue that for as long as both parties are represented by candidates. Okay, next slide. I think this is the last discussion goes for the elections. So the village clerk acts as the election officer of the village and is responsible for the general. When the polls close, the inspectors then begin canvassing the votes, and they also come out and then before 9 a.m. the next day, we must file the results, including the total number of votes cast for each. In the event of a tie, villages do have the option to have a runoff election between the two tied candidates. That would be held on the first Tuesday, at least 10 days after the certification of the tie result. However, the candidates can agree to waive that runoff election, just have the election decided by drawing lots. Oh, looks like my audio is a little bit on. Let me just try and switch over.
Okay, now we're just going to start into general rules for all of, all municipal elections. So voter qualifications. To qualify as a voter, you have to be a U.S. citizen. You have to be 18 years old, although you can pre-register at 16 or 17, but you cannot vote until you reach age 18. You have to be a resident of New York State and the county, city, or village that you want to vote in for at least 30 days before the election. You have to not be in prison for a felony conviction. That one kind of surprises some people. That law changed in May of 2021, where the state restored voting rights to all New York residents who are not currently in prison. Prior to this change, New York did not allow people on parole to vote, and now that's changed. So now as soon as they're released from prison, they're allowed to re-register to vote. New Yorkers who are on parole, probation, or other supervised release are also entitled to vote. And New Yorkers who are in jail for a misdemeanor or a violation conviction are similarly eligible to register to vote. There's actually only 9 states in the country where a person with a felony conviction permanently loses their right to vote, in that state only. So if a person with a felony conviction in one of those states moves permanently to New York, they are entitled to register to vote here. There are 23 states, New York included, where the ability to vote is restored after prison. 15 states where the right to vote is restored after prison, parole, and probation. 1 state where the right to vote is restored after prison and parole. And then in Maine, Vermont, and Washington, D.C., voting is never restricted. So a person, even if they're in prison on a felony conviction, they can vote from prison. So back to New York State qualifications. You can also you have to have not been adjudged mentally incompetent by a court. That one doesn't come up very often. And then you can't claim the right to vote elsewhere. So you can't be registered to vote in Florida and vote in New York, and also try to vote in New York. Next slide. So to vote in an election in New York, you have to be registered to vote. You can register with the local county board of elections. Then if you do that, then you're entitled to vote in any election covering that location, so village, town, city, county, where you reside. Voter registration forms have to be received by the Board of Election by the 10th day before the election in order to vote. New York does not have same-day registration, although that's an issue that is debated a lot and has been put forth a couple times. People can register to vote online using the New York State Board of Elections online voter registration portal. They can register to vote in person at the County Board of Elections, and either in person or on the DMV website if they already have DMV-issued identification. Registration forms can also be requested online or by calling the 1-800-4VOTE hotline. Next slide. To make changes to a voter registration, there's a special change of name or address form. Those have to be received at least 15 days before an election by the County Board of Elections for that to go into effect. Next slide. There are special provisions for victims of domestic abuse. As many of you know, public voter rolls are public. They're subject to FOIL disclosures. They're subject to public inspection. So New York State does allow victims of domestic violence to apply for a special confidential registration. This is done by, they have to swear a statement to their local County Board of Elections stating that they're a victim of domestic violence and they wish to have their voter registration record kept confidential because of the threat of physical or emotional harm to themselves or a family member. Once this is received, their voter registration record is kept separate and apart from other registrations, and that's good for 4 years. So their voter registration record will not be made available for inspection or copying by the public, except election officials acting within the scope of their official duties. Under a separate section of the law, they can also be excused from having to go to the polling place to vote, and they can get a special ballot that's similar to an absentee ballot but isn't considered an absentee ballot. Next slide. Residency. So residency issues don't usually pop up when a person registers to vote, but they usually come up when during the absentee and affidavit ballot canvassing process, the candidate petitioning process, or when a candidate's residency or duration of residency is challenged. When determining residency, there's a variety of factors that can be considered. There's no set rule that you have to look at certain things. So people can look, you know, the County Board of Elections is going to look at factors like their residence for income tax purposes, their age, marital status. So, you know, if it's an 18-year-old, they're probably still living with their parents, so they'll, you know, look at the residence of their parents. If you're married, they'll, you know, check your spouse's address as well. They'll look at real property records. So if you own real property, that's an indication that you live there. Motor vehicle records and utility bills are often used to prove residency as well. A voter's residence and the duration of residence determines where they can register to vote and whether that person can be a candidate for public office. So it really is quite important. If a person has 2 residences in New York, they can choose which to use for voting purposes. This is not the case elsewhere in other states. Some states use the term domicile to figure out where somebody technically lives for voting purposes. So, you know, that is showing that you spend more time there. There's a lot more factors. But if somebody has, you know, a house in a city and then they have a house up in the Adirondacks that they split their time evenly between, they can choose either residence to use as their address for voting purposes. So the courts have said that the crucial factor in determining if an individual is qualified to register and vote from a particular residence is whether he or she has manifested an intent to adopt that residence as a permanent and principled home, coupled by his or her physical presence without any aura of sham. So basically, you have to physically live in a place and you have to intend to stay there permanently. So somebody that's just up here visiting for the summer with no intention of living here permanently would not be qualified to register to vote in that summer location. The same thing where even if you bought a house and intend to live there permanently, if you're not there yet, you can't use it for voting purposes. So if you buy a house up here that's having work done on it, and you're not moving in for 3 months, you can't use that yet because your physical presence isn't there. All right, next slide. So residency of candidates. Technically, there's no state law requirement that a candidate for local office live in the district in which the election is sought at the time their petition is filed. Public officers law, however, states that they must satisfy residency requirements as of the time they are elected. So they have to live there by the election date. That being said, local charters or laws, your village, town, city, county laws might have stricter residency requirements in that they may require that the person prove their residency as of the time the petition is filed. So different offices also have different requirements. So, for example, candidates for the New York State Senate or Assembly, they have to meet 2 constitutional residency requirements. The first being 5 years of residency in the state, and the second being residency in their district for 12 months immediately preceding the election. And that residency has to be continuous, not intermittent. So they can't just spend summers somewhere for, you know, six years. That's not good enough. They have to live there for 12 months straight through. For an election immediately following a redistricting, a candidate is not required to have lived in the district, but they have to have resided in the county in which the district is contained for 12 months before the election. The factors for determining candidate residency are the same as for looking at voter residency. You know, the utility bills, property records, DMV records. And while there's no single test for determining residency, the Court of Appeals has previously held that a candidate will fail the constitutional residency requirement if they register to vote in another jurisdiction during that required residency period. So if, you know, you have to have lived here for 5 years and at some point during that 5 years you registered to vote in Pennsylvania, then that does not, you have not met the residency requirement. And a challenge to residency will fail unless they can prove by clear and convincing evidence that the candidate did not meet the residency requirement. And so clear and convincing evidence is a stricter standard than most civil cases where that are just decided on a preponderance of the evidence, which just means more likely than not. Clear and convincing evidence is more of like a 75% sure standard of proof there. It's not quite as heavy a burden as the beyond a reasonable doubt that's used for criminal cases, but it is stricter than just a regular lawsuit kind of case. Okay, next slide. So political primaries. Generally, New York is a closed primary state. To change a voter's party enrollment for the primary election in any given year, they have to submit the form no later than February 14th. Basically, a closed primary state means that only people that are enrolled in a political party may vote in the primary or participate in the party's caucus. We don't have a lot of caucuses in New York State. However, a political party may opt to allow non-party members to vote in their primary election as specified by their own party rules, but that's a very rare occurrence. And a political party may actually cancel a voter's enrollment in their party if they find that the voter is not in sympathy with the principles of such party. Usually, each party will have its own set of procedures for investigating that. And then once a voter is disenrolled pursuant to these proceedings, they're no longer allowed to participate in the party's primary elections or caucuses. Okay, so next up, you can change slide. Designating petitions. So people wishing to run for elective office, they can either be designated by a political party or nominated through the filing of an independent nominating petition. So designating petitions are the ones for people who are designated by a political party. These petitions have to be in substantially the form set forth by the election law. If a party nominates its candidates through the primary process, then party designations are made on this designating petition. And the number of signatures required varies by office. Only enrolled members of the party are qualified to vote for an office or eligible to sign a designating petition. So a Democrat cannot sign a Republican designating petition, just like a Republican cannot sign a Democratic candidate's designating petition. And if the designating petition contains a greater number of candidates than there are offices to be elected, the entire petition is invalidated, even if the extra candidates decline to be on the ballot. Okay, next slide. This next slide is just an example of a sample of a village designating petition. these are basically the form is set forth by the state. You can just get a copy of these petitions. You can technically make your own, but it has to have certain information, and it's probably just easier for people to use the form set forth by the state. Okay, next one. So, like I said, nominating petitions have to be signed by not less than 5% of the enrolled voters of the party residing within the election district. So a Republican running for village office has to have signatures equal to or greater to 5% of the registered Republicans in that given village, except for these offices that are listed below that have certain set numbers that they don't need to go above. And these numbers do not include New York City. They have their own numbers and set by borough and by county and by cities. So for cities or counties that have more than 250,000 inhabitants, you don't need more than 2,000 signatures on that. If you have more than 25,000, less than 250,000, then it's 1,000 signatures. Any other city or county, it's 500 signatures. Congressional districts, it's 1,250 signatures. State senatorial districts is 1,000 signatures. Assembly districts, 500 signatures. County legislative districts are 500 as well. And then for any village, it's 5,000. It's 5% of the number of enrolled voters of the party residing in the village. Also, for any political subdivision contained within a larger subdivision, the smaller one cannot require a higher number of signatures than the larger one. So, the city of Syracuse cannot require more signatures than Onondaga County in which it sits. Okay, next one. Candidates can also be nominated through an independent nominating petition. So this would be to run for office on a line other than an official party line as an independent. A candidate has to file one of these. And the number of signatures required to qualify the candidacy of a person for an independent party line also varies by office. These can be signed by any registered voter who's not already signed a designating petition and who's qualified to vote. So this is not, you don't have to have just Republicans or just Democrats sign this. This can be any voter who hasn't already signed a petition. So next slide is just this is an example of the independent nominating petition. And then you can go to the next slide. So you'll see that it's actually higher numbers required to get on the ballot for an independent nominating petition than if you are going through the party. So for any county office outside of New York City, you need 1,500 signatures. Any congressional district, it's 3,500 signatures. A state senatorial district, it's 3,000 signatures. So that's 2,000 signatures more than is required for the designating petition. And then for a state assembly district, it's 1,500, and then the villages are now set by your population. So if you have more than 5,000 people in your village, then you only need 100 signatures. If you have less than 5,000, you need 75, less than 3,000, 50, and then if you are in a village that has less than 1,000 people, it would be 5% of the voters at the last village election. And again, the same rules apply that a smaller subdivision contained within a larger subdivision cannot have a larger number of signatures required than the larger area. Okay, so that's so for the petitions, invalidation of a single signature or even a number of signatures, if there's no fraud involved, doesn't render the entire page invalid. There's no requirement that they be in sequential date order. There's no real reason why they couldn't be, but that's not a rule. If petitions are required to have a cover sheet under this one section of the election law, that is a fatal defect and is uncurable. So if they forget to send their cover sheet in, they're done. They have to go back and get every signature again. The pages of a petition must be numbered. That is a curable defect. So if it happens, if the pages are not numbered, it will invalidate the petition, but that can be fixed by just numbering them. And then the date of the election on the petition has to be accurately and correctly stated. Next one. So candidate qualifications. Boards have to assume that the candidate meets the constitutional and statutory qualification requirements. Unless there's a challenge made to it, that, you know, it's a rebuttable presumption, but when a candidate says that, you know, they are who they are and they live where they live, the boards assume that that's true until somebody says, hey, you know, that person doesn't live there. A candidate can't run for two offices where one would be precluded from holding both at the same time. So you can't run for, you know, town supervisor and town highway supervisor, because those two positions are, you know, one is supervisory to the other. There's actually no requirement that a person must be registered to vote to be a candidate for public office. So, yeah. All right, next one. So candidates' information. The candidate has to be able to be identified by the information provided on their petition. The law requires that their name, the office being sought, including the district number, or, you know, sometimes there'll be ward numbers, or that has to be in there. Their place of residence, and then their post office address if that's different. They can use a nickname as long as it's a recognizable nickname, like Tom for Thomas or Jack for John, and that's what they're known as throughout the community. They cannot use titles or descriptors. So you cannot have Dr. John Doe. You cannot have John Doe Esquire, John Doe PhD. That's not allowed. Misspellings are not fatal if there's no intent to mislead. Next one. So petition signers, the election law requires the date, name of signer, their residence, and then the town or city for each signer. And they all have to be provided in ink, no pencil, and no electronic signatures as of now. That's another thing that's being pushed for, but is not yet enshrined in our laws. So the signature has to have the date it was made, and strict compliance is required. Signatures that are dated after the witness statement on the petition, there's a witness requirement that has to be signed. Those will be invalidated. A signature, they don't have to be in cursive, but if they print their name and that's not how they signed it on their election registration, that might be invalidated as well. Power of attorneys cannot sign a petition for a voter. That is not allowed. And then the signer has to provide their town or city. Their village or hamlet is not acceptable. So if you live in the village of Fayetteville, which is contained within the town of Manlius, you have to say the town of Manlius, not the village of Fayetteville, as your address. And then signatures of people who signed a previous petition for the same office are not valid. So you can't sign two people's petitions. Those aren't, that's not allowed. And then this is a kind of an outdated concept, but a wife is not allowed to sign her name as Mrs. John Jones if her name is Mary. She can sign as Mrs. Mary Jones. Next slide. So alterations. Alterations or corrections can be made to information on the signer's line of the petition, and don't have to be initialed unless you're trying to change the signature or the date, and then those two do have to be initialed by the petitioner. Okay, next one. So fraud. Fraud is usually an issue left for judicial proceedings. That's not something that usually board elections or, you know, village officials, that's not something that will usually have to be decided by them. It's usually, you know, that's left to the courts to make that distinction. If that is the case and there is fraud found, fraudulent signatures will be invalidated. And if it's found that fraud permeates the petition, or if it was the candidate who committed the fraud, the entire petition is invalidated, even if the number of non-fraudulent signatures remaining would be sufficient to clear that signature requirement number. And again, this is the challenger must show permeation of fraud by clear and convincing evidence. So that's another way of saying that it's highly and substantially more likely that fraud occurred than not. Okay, next slide. So campaign finance disclosures. The election law requires that candidates and political committees file statements disclosing information about the contributions that they receive and how that money is spent, made in connection with an election. This is a very, very robust area of case law. There are, you know, there's probably been a decision about every type of expenditure that's possible, including, a sheriff that tried to use campaign funds to pay for his master's degree. That one is not allowed unless you can prove that it's required for the office you hold. So candidates have to file 2 disclosure statements prior to the election. The first one is about 30 days, but no more than 45 days before the election. The second one is filed no less than 11 days, but no more than 15 days before the election. And then the last one is filed within 27 days after the election. Next slide. Absentee ballots. A voter is eligible for an absentee ballot if they will be absent from the county on election day, they're unable to appear at the polls due to temporary or permanent illness or disability, they're unable to appear because they're the primary caregiver of one or more individuals who are ill or physically disabled, if they're a resident or patient of a Veterans Health Administration hospital, or if they're in jail or prison for any other reason than a felony conviction. This would be anyone who's awaiting grand jury action, awaiting trial, or serving a sentence for a misdemeanor. Now, last year's election, at the beginning of COVID through the end of 2023, it was allowed, fear of contracting COVID or other communicable disease was included under the definition of a temporary illness or disability. That is no longer the case. That provision spun down at the end of 2023. So just fear of contracting COVID is no longer an acceptable reason to request an absentee ballot. Okay, next slide. And then a person can apply for these using the online portal. They can go in person to their local county board of elections, or they can designate another person to deliver their application in person to their local county board of elections and receive their ballot that way instead of having it mailed. And again, with village elections, that would request would be made directly to the village clerk. The next slide is just an example of the New York State absentee ballot application, which is required to be used now. Actually, it's required to be used by school districts as well if they are a district that has personal registration. So this form prescribed by the Board of Elections is what everyone has to use now. So next slide, absentee ballot deadlines. So an absentee ballot that's requested by mail, if they want the ballot mailed or through the electronic absentee ballot application transmittal system, it has to be received no later than 15 days before the election. If you're requesting an absentee ballot be handed to you in person when you turn in your application, that can be done up until the day before the election. Those deadlines are set to change January 1st for elections after January 1st, 2024. So that will change it to, the new deadline will be that they have to be received no later than the 10th day before the election instead of the 15th day. So it's giving people a bit more time to turn in the application. Okay, next slide. So absentee ballots for permanent disability. So a voter who claims permanent illness or disability can make an application and receive an absentee ballot for every election thereafter if they say that they are permanently disabled. It has a special statement that has to be signed by the voter. So after that happens, the Board of Elections marks their registration card with permanently disabled, and then for every primary that they're, for every primary where their enrolled party has every special election, every general election, for every type of election that they are eligible to vote in, they will be sent an absentee ballot to their last known address until their voter registration is canceled. So this is just a permanent. They will never have to request an absentee ballot after that. Okay, next slide. Military voters. So people that are serving in the military along with their spouses and their dependents can register as a military voter in New York. This gives them a special ballot for all federal, state, and local races where they would be otherwise entitled to vote if they were living at their New York residence. They have to fill out a federal postcard application and return it to their county board of elections. Again, with school districts and village elections, these are handled directly through the village or school district clerk instead of going through the county board of elections. So the 2023 military ballot deadline, that's the next slide. So October 28th is the last day for the board to receive registration for a military voter to be able to vote in the general election occurring on November 7th. That's also the last day to receive an application by mail if they've not previously registered. So the first one is for people who are not yet registered to vote, and the second one is for people whose application, if they have not yet previously registered. And then October 31st is the last day for them to receive an application by mail if they've previously registered as a voter. And then November 6th is the last day to apply in person if they previously registered, and then November 7th is the last day to postmark a ballot. So military ballots are different from absentee ballots in that absentee ballots have to be received by the time the polls close. Military ballots have to be postmarked by the day of the election. They can be received up until November 20th. So there's a big difference between military ballots and absentee ballots. Okay, next slide. So early voting is kind of a new thing in New York State. So beginning the 10th day prior to the election and ending on the 2nd day before an election, people who are registered and eligible to vote can do so at any of the locations designated by the Board of Elections as early voting sites. This may or may not be the same location designated as the voter's election day polling place, so there's more options for early voting. So in counties with less than 500,000 registered voters, there has to be one early voting place for every 30,000 registered voters. But there doesn't have to be more than 10 or less than one. So there has to be at least one, but you don't have to have more than 10. So in counties with more than 500,000 registered voters, there has to be an early voting place for every 40,000 registered voters. Okay, next slide. So the Board of Elections has to secure all the ballots and scanners used for early voting from the beginning of the early voting period through the close of the polls on Election Day. So unlike absentee ballots that can't be canvassed until the polls close, early voting ballots are allowed to be counted 1 hour prior to the close of polls. So those you can start counting early voting ballots at 8 p.m. And then the close of polls is at 9 p.m., and that's when all of the other votes are canvassed, including absentee ballots. Okay, next one. Election inspectors. So for each election district, there has to be 4 election inspectors, except with the case of village elections that we discussed earlier. So at every general election where there's 2 voting machines used, there has to be an additional 2 poll clerks. And then these appointments do have to be equally divided between the major political parties, regardless of the candidates on the ballot. Election inspectors have to be registered voters, and they have to be residents of the county in which they serve. So they do not have to be residents of, the smaller. They don't have to be residents of the town or the village or the Senate district or the assembly district. They just have to be residents of the county. So somebody that lives in one city can be an election inspector in another city as long as they live in the same county. And then the rate of pay for these folks is set by the county legislature. There's no minimum that has to be paid to these folks. Outside of New York City, there is a minimum within, but so most people do, the minimum wage. Next slide. Election watchers. So any party committee, any independent body whose candidates are on the ballot, that doesn't happen very often. And then any political committee that's supporting or opposing a ballot proposition, so if there's a specific political action committee that has put all of their money on, this one thing, they can also have a watcher. So each one of these can have 3 watchers for every election district. Watchers have to be appointed by the chair or the other officer of that body. So the local Republican and the local Democratic Party have to appoint their watchers. It can't just be anybody who just decides to be one. So these people can be present at the polling place at least 15 minutes before unlocking, and then before the unlocking and examination of the voting machines or the ballot box at the opening of the polls until after the signing of the inspector's returns and the proclamation of the results. Next slide. So like I said, the parties have to appoint these people, and they should be issued a certificate in writing, and these should be delivered to the inspectors of the election district, designating them as watchers. A watcher has to be a qualified voter of the city or county in which they're to serve, and a watcher cannot be a candidate for public office in the same election. There is nothing stopping a candidate from visiting a polling place, though, while the polls are open, but they cannot act as a watcher. Okay, next slide. So affidavit ballots. If a voter's name appears with a notation indicating that the board has already issued that person an absentee, military, or special ballot, they can't vote on a voting machine at an early voting site or on election day, but you can have them vote by a paper affidavit ballot. The same thing happens if a person presents themselves to vote and they're not in the voter rolls, even though they say they live in the district and you can't find the registration. They can vote by an affidavit ballot. A recent court decision actually just said that if a person shows up at an incorrect polling place, but they're in the right county, in the right assembly district, they're also entitled to vote by affidavit ballot. That was actually, they changed the law on that one. That was recently signed by Governor Hochul last year, I believe it was. Okay, next slide. So electioneering. So during the hours that the polls are open, there's a prohibition against electioneering, both within the polling place or even in the street or sidewalk outside of the polling place, within a 100-foot radius, and that's measured from the entrance. So that's from the doors, 100 feet out and around. They can't electioneer. You can't have people wearing political banners, buttons, posters, or placards. None of that is allowed in the polling place or within that 100-foot radius. Okay, next slide. So voter challenges. So any voter can be challenged as to his or her right to vote or their right to vote by absentee or military ballot. And this challenge can be made by an inspector, a clerk, a watcher, or any registered voter that's in the polling place. Anybody that's there to vote, if they see somebody and they say, hey, I know that person doesn't live in this town, they live in the next town over, they can make that challenge. So when an applicant is challenged, the inspector starts out with a preliminary oath that says, you do solemnly swear or affirm that you will make true answers to such questions as may be put to you concerning your qualifications as a voter. If the voter refuses, they are not allowed to vote. Next slide. So once that preliminary oath is administered, the inspector is then supposed to question the voter about his right to vote at the polling place. Where do you live? Can you provide proof of that? How long have you lived there? And if the person refuses to answer any of the questions, they, again, are not allowed to vote. So if the inspector believes after questioning that the voter is qualified or the challenge is withdrawn, then the voter can vote. If the voter appears deficient in any way, then a qualification oath is administered. So that would be, you swear you're 18 years of age, you're a citizen of the United States, you've been a resident of this state and of this county for 30 days preceding this election, you reside at this address, that you have not voted in this election, and that you do not know of any reason why you're not qualified to vote. And then that also is accompanied by the statement that they understand that making a false statement can be considered perjury, and that somebody doing that could be found guilty of a misdemeanor. There's also separate oaths for people that are accused of being bribed for their vote, and then people who have been previously adjudged incompetent by a court. So if anybody refuses any of those separate oaths, they're not allowed to vote. But if they do swear the oath, they'd be permitted to vote, usually by an affidavit ballot. Okay. Next slide. So on election day, the polls have to be open for general elections from 6 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock in the evening. Election day ballots, absentee ballots, and military ballots cannot be canvassed prior to the close of the polls. As we discussed earlier, the early voting ballots can be canvassed starting at 8 p.m. So at the close of the polls, the inspectors close the polls. They account for any paper or affidavit ballots. Paper ballots also might have to be used if there's an issue with the voting machine, if it gets jammed up or something like that. So there might be paper ballots and affidavit ballots. So then they would canvass the voting machines, account for the paper ballots, cast and canvass all of the ballots received via other means, absentee ballots, military ballots, and the like, and ascertain the total vote. They're not actually allowed to adjourn until everything's completed. That's by statute. Next slide, which I actually think is our last slide. So once all the votes have been canvassed, the chair of the Board of Inspectors will make a public oral proclamation of the total number of votes cast at the election at the polling place for all candidates of each office. They also, in the alternative, can post the results, tape or tally sheet or whatever else was used to calculate the total votes instead of making the oral pronouncement. And then you know, there people might challenge the results. That's a topic for another day. But other than that, next slide. I think we are finished today. We finished a little bit early. So if anybody has any questions, I'm always available by email. And I look forward to hearing from all of you. And again, we will be doing a special school district election presentation as part of our School Law 101 series that will probably happen early in 2024 prior to any of the deadlines for school district elections. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.